Hello everyone, Tim Brown. Welcome back to my Apple Podcast, the podcast that makes a personal connection to everything Apple. This episode promises to be a very interesting one. I plan to examine the design features that come with iOS 7, offering a comparison with previous versions, specifically iOS 6.1.3, which I still have installed on my iPhone 3GS. Overall, I find iOS 7 to be a great improvement over previous versions, especially when it comes to the user interface. However, I have some reservations about the graphic elements and sometimes wonder if this has to do with the theoretical underpinnings and philosophy of design that went into this radical new conception. Some insight into this matter can best be gleaned from statements by Apple's designer Johnny Ive, as mentioned in an article featured in The Verge by Dante DeRazio. As Ive once stated, "We understood that people had already become comfortable with touching glass. There was an incredible liberty in not having to reference the physical world so literally. We were trying to create an environment that was less specific. It got design out of the way." Now, the difficulty I have with this statement is what Ive means by getting design out of the way. The statement, of course, has a lot to do with Apple moving away from skeuomorphism to a flatter design, the flatter design meaning more simplicity. As Ives continues, true simplicity is, well, you just keep going and going until you get to the point where you go. Yeah, well, of course, where there's no rational alternative. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds more like a philosophical argument than it does concerns that maybe the average user has about iOS 7. For example, take the terms a priori and a posteriori, which are different forms of knowledge generally associated with Kantian philosophy. The term a priori, for example, meaning from the earlier, and a posteriori, from the later, are used in philosophy to distinguish two types of knowledge, justification, or argument. A priori knowledge or justification is independent of experience. Galen Strawson has stated that an a priori knowledge is one in which you can see that it is true lying on your couch. You don't have to get up off your couch and go outside and examine the way things are in the physical world. You don't have to do any science. Now, does this sound very similar to you? Now, you take a posteriori, which is knowledge or justification dependent on experience or empirical evidence. And what do we mean by empirical evidence? The skeuomorphic design that we're familiar with in the earlier versions. All those things that resemble the actual world, a notepad, a calendar, and so forth. These are examples of empirical evidence that the designers at Apple want to get away from, moving closer and closer to a more simplistic, rational universe. But what does this mean for us, the average user? What I would like to provide is a side-by-side comparison of iOS 7 and iOS 6 with the hope of answering a few questions. 1. Does the simpler design lead to more clarity or less clarity? Does the simpler design in iOS 7 improve levels of functionality? Have we matured to such a level that we no longer require skeuomorphic designs? Or really is this just a matter of personal taste? Is Apple more concerned with the philosophical concepts behind this implementation? Or are they really concerned with the practicalities of the user experience? Okay, let's begin. On the left-hand side is a screenshot of the iPhone 3GS with version 6.1.3 installed, and on the right is the latest version of iOS 7. What do you notice? Well, obviously right away, you notice the flat icons on the right that characterizes iOS 7. We no longer have the subtle shadow areas that render the objects in 3 dimensions or the slight reflected light that you see along the surface of the icons in the earlier version. The earlier icons also have a slight drop shadow added to them, giving them an added clarity and accentuating them in terms of how they are distinguished from the background. In the iOS 7 version, everything is flatter, and if there's anything that is spatial about the relationship, it is inherent in the UI more so than in the static relationship between foreground and background. Okay, let's look at the two settings icons on both versions. Obviously, in the older version, the settings icon looks more realistic. It almost appears in low relief because of the range of tonalities and detail inherent in that icon, whereas the one in the latest version, it's a lot flatter. Inside the applications, you can see the obvious distinctions. Again, the icons are flatter. Apple makes full use of the edge-to-edge design in the latest version. They've completely eliminated the linear gradients that design the header tags up above, and you no longer have those floating tiles that separate the different categories. Instead, in the latest version, everything is flattened out and you just have these very subtle white bands going across the surface. There are also a few more extra features built into the settings, including controlling the size of your text. It's also interesting to see the comparison between the Notes applications. On the left, in the previous version, there's a clear reference to a notepad with the rolled paper, yellow tablet, and the brown tab along the top. When you look at the latest version on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a very intentional need to remove any reference to the notepad. Still using lines, but lines are used more in a simplistic way as pure design elements rather than as elements that reference the real world. And like many of the features throughout iOS 7, the icons along the bottom are understated and quite faint, almost barely recognizable, or as I've stated, getting designed out of the way. The same distinctions can also be noticed in the Maps apps for the earlier and later versions. When you look at the earlier version, you can see you have a search window up above, just like the later version, but the earlier version is still distinguished by that linear gradient tab along the top with the icons etched inside the tab, again reinforcing that three-dimensionality. You will also notice that in iOS 7, Apple removed the page curl effect along the bottom right, and instead including three icons along the bottom with the familiar baby blue flat simplistic icons along the bottom. You can definitely notice the improved graphics, however, in the latest version. You can also notice the distinct differences in the tabs that pop up from the pinned locations. In the latest version, the tab almost blends right into the background because the drop shadow and skeuomorphic design is completely eliminated. Apple's new concept of design in iOS 7 is also evident in the need to eliminate the page curl, which again looks too much like an actual paper turning, and Apple doesn't want to see that anymore, so it just goes to flat layout with buttons that you just click on, again highlighting the sky blue, baby blue buttons that you see throughout. Now what is nice though is that you can now share your location, which is an added feature. And not surprisingly, in similar fashion with the music apps, you can see in the former version there's more emphasis placed on the horizontal registers that separates each song from the other. Likewise, the buttons along the bottom have a much stronger tonality to them, whereas in the latest version, Apple is taking advantage of the edge-to-edge design, keeping everything almost text-based with very faint icons along the bottom. Of course, the most revolutionary change to the music app is the introduction of iTunes Radio. In the message apps of the earlier version and the current version, you see a lot of the same things. The bar along the top with the linear gradient is still evident, whereas in the new version, new message is just a text-based label that is provided. The icons and the keys are very different in how they're presented, with the former version still highlighting the objects or the keys as three-dimensional by adding drop shadow and increasing the contrast between the foreground and background, whereas in the later versions, everything is flatter, less contrast, and more subtle in appearance. And when the app stores are placed side by side, they almost look identical. The only thing that separates them, once again, is the gradient bar along the top and the increased contrast of the tabs along the bottom. Apple still keeping everything light in the iOS 7 version, placing greater emphasis on the edge-to-edge design. And adding the wish list option is definitely a bonus for iOS 7. The same principles can be applied to both the video applications, with the latest version of iOS 7 adding buttons along the bottom to make navigation a lot easier, with an additional option to now play your videos from the cloud. One of the few constants that remains in both versions of iOS 6 and iOS 7 is the podcast app. They look almost identical on both versions, which is an indication that we can expect some major changes to the podcast app in the near future. In some cases, the changes in iOS 7 are so drastic they seem almost reactionary. This is clearly evident in the way Game Center was designed. In the former version, as you can see, there's a clear reference to sports, that is, the green turf associated with mini sports, whereas in the new version, we have, again, this very text-based design, with the only design elements being the colored balloons along the top. This is also another clear example of getting rid of design. And as you can see in the weather app, the same adjustments have been made. You no longer see the floating rounded edge panel, instead preferring the edge-to-edge design. Likewise, the tonalities of the later version are a lot more subtle and atmospheric. And look at the difference that is placed on the calculator app this time around. Once again, reinforcing the simplicity of design and avoiding skeuomorphism, that is, creating buttons that actually look like buttons with reflective surfaces. Everything's flat and simple. Now, when you look at the Newsstand app, you really get the feeling that Apple came up short in terms of its complete overhaul of the operating system. Here, the Newsstand application has been entirely redesigned. Yet, we haven't seen this yet with the iBookstore app, which clearly references the bookshelves. However, it is safe to say that this is a sign of things to come in terms of Apple's complete elimination of skeuomorphism. Clearly, the new design of iOS 7 emphasizes flatness over three-dimensionality, avoids skeuomorphism, and places a heavy emphasis on text-based links and design elements. The question still remains, though. Do the adjustments in and of themselves constitute a better user experience in iOS 7? Could the same adjustments have been made to the previous version of iOS 6? Is skeuomorphism really that much of a distraction? Or have we, the average user, become embroiled in a philosophical debate over rationalism and empiricism and the need to remove the subjectivity of personal taste in favor of universal criteria? My name is Tim Brown. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of My Apple Podcast. Check me out next time.